Drafting Archetypes is brought to you by Game Grid Lehigh. Game Grid Lehigh is an amazing place to buy and sell Magic the Gathering singles. Whether you're building a new cube or crafting your new constructed deck, Game Grid Lehigh is the place to do it. Got a draft coming up with some friends? Buy some seal product here and get it quick. So click the referral link in the description to help out the show, and don't forget to use the code DRAFTPRO10 to get 10% off on your next order at gglehigh.com.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today we're going to be talking about drafting blue-white in Dominaria United. As always, you can follow along with the notes at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes if you're a limited guru or above level patron of the podcast over there. So let's get into it. A common theme in Dominaria United is figuring out which colors thing your deck is about, and or how you're blending like the two things together if you have like two primary colors. I talked about this in the episode last week about white-black, that you're often going to be like a white deck with black cards or a black deck with white cards, and there's kind of a philosophically fundamentally different approach there where white represents large games and black represents small games. White more tempo, black more attrition. I think white-blue is in a similar spot, kind of all around, where you're either white-leaning or blue-leaning. The more white you are, the more wide, large boards, large games you are, the more blue you are. The more small you are, less attrition-ish, kind of, than black. We'll get into what blue is doing in a little bit. Certainly slightly different trade-offs at work, but a similar situation where you want to figure out what your deck's plan is, and often that plan is going to be more like, I'm doing white's thing or I'm doing blue's thing. Doing white's thing in this format generally means caring about the card Argivian Cavalier, the 3-mana 2/2 that makes it 1/1 and has Enlist. It's kind of just like white is generally trying to go wide. Cavalier is a very good rate for doing that. Sets up cards like Argivian Phalanx, though I think that blue-white, even if you're on the white side, is relatively unlikely to want Argivian Phalanx, because what blue-white is doing typically cares about instants and sorceries in some way, and most of those are cards that are not putting creatures into play for you, meaning that likely not all of your cards, and often many of your cards, are not dedicated to getting more creatures into play quickly, which makes Phalanx a lot worse than if you're really just like curving out creatures. But you care about Argivian Cavalier, and I think that if you're white-based, you're looking to play relatively high-power, cheap creatures, flying creatures, and tempo spells. And, you're pretty happy to, curve like Beneficial Sleeper or Samite Herbalist into maybe another creature, ideally, and then a Tolarian Geyser to like remove your opponent's blocker, get some damage in. Maybe then they get a couple blockers into play. Maybe you use Stall for Time to lock those down, get more damage in. Maybe that ends the game, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you get them low, and then you play a flyer, and then they start like trying to race you, and you finish them off with the flyer because you got them low in life with your like early creatures and tempo spells. I would say that roughly that is like what you're trying to do with a base white plus blue cards tempo deck. I think it's kind of the best deck in the format for Stall for Time, and as long as your curve is low, you can use stuff like Essence Scatter to kind of like stop your opponent from catching up and stabilizing while you get early damage in. Yeah, so that's kind of the like, there are constructed decks that are like this. I guess, sometimes that archetype ends up being called like aggro control, where you exploit some kind of threat, protect that threat, and or destabilize your opponent while that threat takes advantage of like the tempo offered by not costing very much mana to end the game. And so that's kind of the like white plus blue space. As for blue plus white, I think that blue plus white often really revolves around Wrath and or Tura, the uncommon legends, and they fall into sort of like a protect the queen strategy where you play one of them and then either of those cards gives you some kind of advantage every time you play a spell. So you have like these 1-for-1 spells and cantrips that extend the game or find you more gas to extend the game. And every time these things happen, you get further ahead in some way. And you have like shore up, take up the shield, protect the negotiators, potentially negate to like protect these creatures while you use like impulse and timely interference and Phyrexian espionage to get more cards, and then artillery blast and destroy evil and even citizens arrest. Even though it doesn't trigger those things, it helps you prolong the game at 1-for-1s while you kind of just ride the incremental advantage that those legends are providing. You can win with, maybe instead of having one of those, you're doing something similar and you just have some Tolarian terrors. Tolarian terror, I think, is like less likely to be the whole thing that's going on in blue-white than in like blue-black, for example, where recurring Tolarian terrors is really big. Tolarian terror is more like, yeah, I have like a bunch of spells and I'm looking for a way to kill someone. This'll do. In blue-white, a little bit more replaceable. So like fine, but not a priority. Like I would generally prefer terror to lookout in blue-black, but lookout to terror in blue-white, for example. Even Academy Wall can do kind of a budget version of the Protect the Queen strategy, usually for a little while, right? It'll help you like not flood out while you're trading resources, but it's not going to kill your opponent. But it can help you find the thing that you're about that will win the game. And so you can play a similar game plan strategically off an Academy Wall to what you would be doing with Wrath, as long as you're drawing to something better that can take over as far as like, how do you win the game after you've like made a bunch of trades and avoided falling behind? So yeah, blue-white I think is fundamentally value over time, basically trying to find a creature that can function like a planeswalker, which both Wrath and Tura do. Like, there are planeswalkers that draw an extra card every turn. There are planeswalkers that make creature tokens every turn. Wrath and Tura do something like that. And so, in Limited, that kind of creature is often what's going to pass for that sort of effect, if that's what you're looking for. But you can kind of think of yourself as, like, the limited version of kind of like a, blue-white Super Friends, like Planeswalker and stuff to stall the game fundamental strategy. Might provide some useful context for like thinking about how the game is going to go and like what it is that's making you win with that kind of deck. Of course, blue-white can also become a defender deck. As always, I personally wouldn't recommend touching defenders without Wingmantle Chaplain, but blue-white's a really, really good place to be if you do have Wingmantle Chaplain. And the combination of Clockwork Drawbridge, Walking Bulwark, Coral Colony, and Academy Wall, those cards interact really well with each other. They can, you can win a game with those cards without drawing Wingmantle Chaplain. Technically, you can win games with those cards even without drafting Wingmantle Chaplain. I still don't think I'd want to try to, but I mean, like, Bulwark plus Academy Wall in particular is a very respectable, like, threat that you have assembled. And so blue-white is kind of like the best shell to go really deep on defenders. Like, I generally prefer my Wingmantle Chaplain decks to be about black so that, like, I can keep casting my Wingmantle Chaplain even if my opponent kills it. Blue-white is more likely to care more about its other walls and then have Chaplain be one of the many things you can do with your walls. And then ideally you can like geyser your Chaplain a few times, but sometimes like if it dies, that's it. And so then you need to have stuff like Bulwark and Coral Colony as kind of your like, well, like your backup plan to win if your opponent has like answered your chaplain, or maybe you like happen to not draw your sentinels slash chaplain or whatever. I think you're more likely to have kind of like a robust wall game plan that can do the other wall stuff. Like you're more likely to win with Bulwark or win with Coral Colony in heavy blue-white defenders than some of the other directions you can go with defenders. As far as splashing, as always, the slower, longer games you're playing, more controlling your deck is, the more you want to splash. Therefore, the like base blue version is much more likely to want to splash than the base white version, since the base blue version's fundamentally more of a control deck, where the base white version's fundamentally more of a tempo deck. So the base blue version will sometimes splash enough that it's not super recognizable as blue white. It's, impulse, etc., blue multicolor base with, destroy evil, maybe some random like white threats, maybe a wrath, and then also removal from any other colors, your lightning strikes and tribute Urborg tributes or tribute to Urborg or whatever, and, maybe fires of victory, maybe you're splashing like tail swipe and you have a micromancer or something. You can end up playing a lot of colors pretty easily in your blue control decks if you want. It's very easy to pivot out from, well, I started with like a blue card, like maybe I started with a blue white gold card, took some blue card draw, and well, here's a removal spell that's the best card in the pack, so I'll just take it regardless of what color it is. Repeat that process a few times, and you've added a bunch of extra colors to your deck. But as long as you still have, like, maybe, Protect the Negotiators and Wrath, and so you're trying to, like, have enough early creatures to make sure that you can use your Wrath and use your Protect the Negotiators, but, like, that's not very many early creatures, because you can find them with Impulse, and you only need, like, 2 or 3 in play. It ends up, blurring the line between, like, this is blue-white X and this is any other Esper deck I've talked about. As for splashing in base white, I think you're most likely to splash red because there's kind of, basically because of Keldon Strike Team. Like, if you're trying to do a go wide thing, Wrath and Balmor is a very good card to splash in a blue-white deck, because, like, in a white-based blue-white deck, because, as I mentioned, you probably have stuff like Argivian Cavalier that's, like, letting you go kind of wide, and then, you have some, like, blue cantrip type stuff that's there for, like, tempo reasons, but you get a Balmor, and now, like, these, like, tempo cards are actually kind of damage explosive, and then once you're wide and aggressive and in blue-white, and like you have Balmor, then Keldon Strike Team is an actual other edition, and this space can pretty easily pivot into any sort of like aggro Jeskai space. You might end up, finding, oh, there are actually more red cards than blue cards that like support an aggressive position, or red's more open than blue because blue is more highly contested in this format during drafts in general. Whatever, you might end up starting out blue-white and then kind of like slowly drifting into white, red, splash blue or whatever. Black is also available as a really light splash for kickers on creatures that you want to play, like Sleeper and Missionary. Green, like, theoretically, there's kind of the like green-white aggro thing that like Strength of the Coalition represents, and like the green-white legends tell you that they're about going wide. But the problem is that the cards are both just not quite as good as the other, like, uncommon legends for the most part. I think green is kind of the least likely color. I have ended up banned, like, a few times, largely just in spots where, like, I have Wrath and Tatiova, and I think both of those cards are really good. But I'm not really splashing green at that point. I am typically more, like, balanced 3, or splashing white, because that's how Tatiova works, since it's double green to cast. But like green isn't really offering you a lot in terms of kickers that you care about. Like, I think the most likely would be trying to kick the fairy into being able to be a 3/3, but I mean, it's a weird deck where that's like a thing that's happening where you're like lightly splashing green to sometimes kick your fairy into a 3/3 flyer. That's a strange deck. Because you're probably not playing the fairy unless you need it for fixing, is my implication there. It is playable as flyer to enable Wrath and protect the negotiators, but whatever. Like I said, I think that's going to be more of a fringe case. So that's kind of the like strategic positioning of the various decks that exist in this space to my mind. I was looking around at stats for some of this stuff. It's still the case that I find like weird details of the stats in this format confusing and or unlikely to be super predictive of what's right for a particular player due to how complex this format is, I guess, is my best guess about the explanation there. I was digging around the like difference between like the aggregate player data and the top player data as far as like win rates of commons and stuff, and I noticed a really weird fluke, which is, or quirk, I guess maybe, which is that Samite Herbalist has the highest win rate in blue-white among commons other than Shield Wall Sentinel. Shield Wall Sentinel is always just clearly understood to be kind of an outlier in common win rates in this format due to it just representing the win rate of Wingmantle Chaplain. But Herbalist is very low sample size, so not really an indicator of like this card is just generally strong. Like when there's a really small sample size, there's usually something going on, like, oh, this is only played if this other thing, and this other thing is what's actually making me win more. But like it has a significant improvement when drawn also. So it's not just like, oh, I only play this in decks that have like a lot of this other card that's great, and it's totally riding on the coattails of that other card. Sort of. But my guess is that the primary factor here among top players succeeding with Samite Herbalist is I think top players are very unlikely to have Samite Herbalist in most of their blue-white decks. I've found Samite Herbalist to be like okay if you have a bunch of enlist, and otherwise I don't really want it. But the card that would make me want it is if I have like multiple copies of Wrath. The idea of like scrying and gaining life every time I use Wrath is pretty appealing. And so if like Samite Herbalist is doing really, really well, just because if you have Samite Herbalist in your deck, you have like maybe multiple Wraths that you're aggressively trying to find with Impulse or whatever, like that combo does sound really good. So as a Wrath enjoyer, I think it does make sense for me to like think a little bit more about Samite Herbalist as a Wrath accomplice or co-conspirator, especially in a really removal heavy deck where you might be decent at like killing your opponent's blockers to be able to attack with Samite Herbalist to help scry for more removal or whatever. There aren't a lot of other ways to tap Samite Herbalist at your leisure. Like there are very few vehicles and stuff like that. But I did note the high win rate of Samite Herbalist there as a thing to consider, especially like it's really hard for me to imagine that there's an explanation that doesn't involve Wrath for what's going on there. So just something to think about. That's kind of my thoughts on what I prepared here. Again, as I keep running into in this format, I feel like I want to go into like more detail. Like it feels like I'm missing like, you know, oh, here's like pick order, here are like the best commons or whatever. But again, it just, I think it varies so much that I think that it's better to have like just an understanding of what your deck is trying to do, and then to like, then I hope the commons kind of naturally like present themselves as helping you do that thing or not do that thing, or do that thing or do one of those things or the other thing or whatever. Definitely would encourage anyone in chat to ask any questions about places where that's not clear, or questions like, you know, when would you prefer impulse to espionage, stuff like that. I would generally prefer impulse incidentally here, especially in the protect the queen type space where you're trying to like find the queen and kind of like keep chaining casting a lot of spells, and like Wrath really likes to operate at instant speed so you don't have to tap your creatures on your turn. So there is stuff like that like I can get into, but it's hard to figure out. Like it's also contextual. Like the more you have, Wrath and Tura, the more you want Impulse, the more you have a bunch of removal, and you're like one for one and looking for a way to get ahead, the more you want Espionage. So like it's still even like not clean there, even just like among those two cards in a control deck. So anyway, gonna turn it over to Twitch chat now for questions. As always, any questions you have about this archetype, regardless of whether you've already said something about it in chat, enter it again now so I know it's still something you want addressed. While I'm waiting for some questions, I want to, of course, thank my new patrons this week, Kyle and Jimmy. Thank you very much for the support. And, of course, remind everyone else, if you're interested in supporting the podcast, getting assorted benefits, notes, polls, coaching discounts, etc., be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. All right. In blue-white, what decks want Tura? I often find a 5-mana creature that dies to lightning strike is hard to play when you want a high spell density. Yeah, so I generally want to play Shore Up if I'm playing Tura, and I want to turn my clunky 5-drop into a clunky 6-drop. And the answer to what decks want to do that is kind of the same decks that want the 6-mana Djinn. The 6-mana Djinn is something that I hadn't really been thinking about when I talked about blue-black, but I think it is a serviceable... My deck is pretty good at stopping my opponent from killing me and playing kind of a long game, but I'm sort of threat light, and I think if my opponent has a few removal spells, I might just deck myself. How do I fix this? Tura is like a blue-white version of that thing, where you're like really, really removal and spell dense, and you're looking to avoid never having a way to kill your opponent. So you go to Tura as a way to like do a high impact thing eventually. So I guess what I'm saying is I want Tura when I'm not feeling like any pressure to cast my 5-mana spell on turn 5. The same way that like I'm not looking to kind of like slam Djinn on turn 6 in blue-black and have that turn the game around. I'm not looking to like play Tura on turn 5 in blue-white. This is for when you're looking for like, okay, it's turn 10. I have a lot more cards than my opponent, but I need to like actually win eventually. What can I find that's gonna like let me impulse for a way to close the game eventually? Often kind of like, roughly anything will do here. Tura is not like a very high priority, but it fills that like I need to like clean up kind of role in a way where like if you can't afford to attack, or like your opponent has like a Magnagoth Sentry, so like just a flyer, like, they maybe have a Magnagoth Sentry, so like you have something like, a Talus Lookout that like can't get through. Tura doesn't need to be getting through to be like getting you closer to win the game. I hope that none of this is making Tura sound especially good. That's intentional, but yeah. I find myself really lacking ways to close the game with blue-white when I don't open a good rare or rare bomb or chaplain. Yep, that's kind of what I'm using Tura for. Should I take cards like Terror more highly in the first packs in case of weak picks in later packs? That's kind of where I am with blue in general, is like the more I, really like just playing a lot of removal and stuff, the more I feel like I need to take chaplain to make sure that I can win a game. As I talked about, I think Terror is worse in blue-white than it is in blue-red or blue-black. But early on, like you're talking about taking Terror more highly in the first packs. In the first pack, I'm not likely to know, which other colors I'm playing with my blue cards. And so, yeah, I'm generally in a space where I want to prioritize Terror early in a draft if I'm in blue, just kind of regardless. I'll note that, like, I couldn't find a subset of like players in blue white or whatever where Terror had good stats. I think Terror kind of like classically has weirdly low stats on 17 lands. I think due to people not like using it right, like playing it like not even not using it right. It's that it's correct to play it when it's not at its best. And when you play it when it's medium, it drags down the stats for relative to its strength when it's best. But you can usually draft it as if it's going to be at its best. And so its performance when you do that is going to be better than its overall stats indicate. But I think in blue-white, you're more often going to experience the medium terrors than the like insane terrors, right? Like it's going to take your whole turn to play it on turn like, 5 or whatever. Whereas like in blue-black, maybe you won't play it till turn 5, but you'll be able to double spell when you play it or something. And like that matters a decent amount. How highly would you pick terrors and how many instants and sorceries do you need to play? Kind of what I was just speaking to. Early on, I would pick them pretty highly because I just take them highly because I don't know what my deck is going to end up like. Later on, I'll take them if I like need a card to fit that role. But again, I think that, they're not going to be amazing here. And I'm not really necessarily like expecting them to or leaning on them being amazing. But they're like a way to get the job done. How many instances and sorceries do you need to play? I haven't like done a lot of science on like playing worst case scenario terrors. Just like I just don't draft in a way where that happens. I tend to like really lean into optimizing the cards that I have, and like I'm pretty happy to play a lot of instants and sorceries anyway. So like if I have terrors, I'm just gonna like have a lot of instants and sorceries also. I think where I would start thinking about like, I have this terror, do I really want to play it, is if I'm like below. If I'm 7 or more instants and sorceries, I'm just going to happily play my terror. If I'm below that, I need to think more about what's going on with my deck. Does blue want to be more spell heavy or creature heavy? Many of its spells tend to favor both approaches. Which one is better? So this is kind of what I was talking about how you need to like choose your lane, and you're going to be, either like I'm a white deck with blue cards or a blue card deck with white cards. If you're a white deck with blue cards, you're going to be like more creature heavy. If you're a blue deck, you're going to be more spell heavy. So like which one is better to me is very similar to any other. I can draft this deck or that deck. Which one's better? And the answer is it just depends on the cards you're seeing, the cards you have, what's open at your table. I think, pretty intentionally, both are viable. Which one's better more often is the thing I could speculate on, but I don't think is, I was going to say not really something you should concern yourself with. But honestly, that's not really true, right? Like, there will be plenty of drafts where you start with, a good blue or white card, and then you get another good blue or white card, and you're like, okay, I'm blue-white, what should I expect my deck to do? The thing is, even in those cases, there are not a lot of cards that are just like, I'm neutral blue-white. Like, I have a good blue-white card. Like, the cards that you have are going to inform your direction. I would say Protect Negotiators is a good example of a like strong, flexible card that I'm roughly equally happy with in either, because like the more spell heavy I am, the more happy I am with like get a small edge while trading 1 for 1. The more creature heavy I am, the better Protect the Negotiators is, because the more it's going to like be a hard counter easily, because I'm more likely to have a wide board. But like it's still just going to be, well, I'm just going to take kind of the best cards and see what direction they put me in, more than I'm going to be like targeting a thing. I say that, but also at the same time, I know that I as a player gravitate toward blue style decks a lot more than white style decks, and all of my judgment calls about which of 2 cards is stronger is usually going to be the blue one. But that doesn't mean that I think that for you the blue version is stronger than the white version, right? Like it might be the case that I'm going to take Essence Scatter over Gideon Cavalier, and so I'm going to end up in the blue version more often, and I'm going to draft knowing that that's a pick that I would make, and therefore draft to plan for that pick and to navigate into blue. But like the stats suggest that our Gideon Cavalier is better than Essence Scatter, I think. And so like blue is a better fit for my natural tendencies in a draft personally, but I wouldn't make the claim that like blue is a better base for decks that are blue and white for players in aggregate than white is. And this is, all very much core to my philosophy about draft in general, and especially in this format. And in this format, a big part of why I'm lower on the data and even lower on pick orders than I usually am. And I'm someone who's low enough that I insisted on creating a new structure for limited content because I hated pick orders so much. So that's kind of my long rant about which is better questions in general. The go wide decks. Are you valuing otherwise underwhelming flyers like Mesa Cavalier? Have you had non-wheel decks that want to exploit / build around flyers? I don't have it in me to value Mesa Cavalier as a card. I can't do it. It would like Mesa Cavalier is strategically fine for what Blue White's doing, but I can't bring myself to like recommend positioning yourself to try to take advantage of Mesa Cavalier. I mentioned that I think that deck does want to use Soaring Drake. Soaring Drake for me is a sometimes treat. There are decks that I have that really want Soaring Drake, decks that I have that don't care about Soaring Drake. I do think that like the go wide decks are particularly into Soaring Drake and Talus Lookout, but like because my predilections are not toward trying to be go wide, I am unlikely to find myself attempting to go wide in a seat where it's contested enough that I have to play Mesa Cavalier to do it. So I'm going to be thinking more about like, am I more likely to use larger numbers of the cards that I like to play rather than like, do I have to play bad versions of them? Have I had non-wall decks that want to build around flyers? Yes. Do you think the Samite Herbalist read could also be in part due to the lack of quality in other commons 2-drop creatures in this archetype? There's Figment, but other commons look really poor in almost any version of this. So the other 2-drop that's most relevant, I think, is Sleeper, particularly because if you're using Geyser and Stall for Time and even more Take Up the Shield, the extra power is pretty big, just in terms of like getting your opponent low, and like I think Sleeper can like attack into there are a bunch of like meaningful 4/4s, and being able to attack into those with Sleeper would Take Up the Shield compared to the other 2-drops that can't is pretty big. I was surprised to note that Figment has like pretty bad stats among all players in blue-white. It seems to me like the white-based decks could use Figment reasonably well. Like it seemed kind of on plan with the like push early damage and then like kind of win the race with like chip shots with flyers, and Figment can do kind of a flying impression when you're trying to close out the game. I think that this might be a spot where disambiguating the data between like base blue decks and base white decks and stuff like that, and figuring out and like looking for, well, how does Figment do in the decks that it's best in? Like, I think Figment is kind of the better creature to round out your like blue white go wide deck. Like, Figment's the better Mesa Cavalier to me. And I think like Herbalist maybe also in that space where you're just like, well, I needed it to, and it was either 2/1 with like a decent ability or 2/2 with a green kicker, and like those are my options for 2-drops. Or I could have a 1/3 that like doesn't have an aggressive like plan at all, so put Herbalist in my deck. I mean, that's fine if what we were trying to account for was why is Herbalist played, but the stats that I was looking at aren't Samite Herbalist is played more than I was expecting. Samite Herbalist was played very, very little. What I was seeing was Samite Herbalist won more than I was expecting, where Samite Herbalist was played very, very little and won very, very much. And to me, that says people aren't just playing Samite Herbalist because they needed it too. They're finding some spot where Samite Herbalist is like actually meaningfully good and specifically improving their win rate in a meaningful way, where it's not just like, oh yeah, this Samite Herbalist is like doing about as well as Benish Sleeper. That's cool. This was like, oh, this Samite Herbalist is doing better than everything else. Something weird's happening. What is it? Negate or Urborgs? So there are a lot of cards in this set with Urborg in the name. Since we're talking about blue, I'm going to assume that this is about espionage. So you're asking about whether I prefer Negate or Urborg espionage. No, that's Phyrexian espionage. So there's Tribute to Urborg and Urborg Repossession. Both of those cards are much better than Negate, but are splashes. I don't know how to compare those cards. Oh, maybe this is like your threat light and you need to like protect your threats in some way. Urborg Repossession is much better than Negate for protecting your threats because you don't have to leave mana up. You can like get them back if something happened, and you don't need to like have it at the right time. You can find it whenever. So as long as you have like access to black mana and you're like threat light and trying to make sure that your threats are around, you should definitely prioritize Repossession over Negate as far as like making sure your threats are there. Does Walking Bulwark have a place even absent other walls in a go-wide archetype like blue-white that can take a little longer to develop, even if it's just to absorb early aggro or soak some trample with an option for damage in the right situation? So, like, Walking Bulwark does have a like 3-mana 3/3 haste mode, which is theoretically kind of interesting in like an aggressive deck. I have not tried playing it in that way. There, are some decks where it blocks okay against, and like the, 3/3 haste is like 3 mana for 3/3 haste is like a pretty interesting creature to have access to in blue-white, since blue-white doesn't usually get that kind of thing. Obviously, if you want to attack with it, it costs an extra 2 mana every turn. But if you can, force your opponent to trade off with it the first time you attack, then you just straight up got a 3 mana 3/3 haste. It's hard for me to imagine playing Walking Bulwark if I actually didn't have any other walls. To me, the question is like, you're kind of a normal blue-white deck that has an Academy wall or two. Do you then want Walking Bulwark because it's like can do that thing on its own, but then it also gives you the upside of like turning this thing that was hanging out anyway into a 5/5 attacker? That's a little bit more interesting to me. Not something I've explored a lot personally, by which I mean I just haven't done that, and not something that I can really dig into the stats to find out. I'm sure that there are people who have the ability to like look at Walking Bulwark's win rate specifically in decks that don't have Chaplain, but I am not among those people. So I'm going to go with I don't know. If I have some other walls that I want to play anyway, then Walking Bulwark is looking like a reasonable card to consider, and I don't think that I like the idea of playing it literally on its own. Do you think the spell-heavy blue-white is better leaning toward control, destroy evil essence scatter, or toward tempo, tolerate geyser, stall for time, shore up? So to me, those are kind of those are the spells that the two different kinds of decks are looking for. If you're control, you're looking for like destroy evil and essence scatter. If you're like tempo, like the geyser and stall for time and shore up and take up the shield are like the spells that you want in the like white version of the deck, which I think of as creature heavy, right? Like I was going to say you almost definitely don't want shore up if you're spell heavy and creature light, because you don't want to play too many cards that need a creature to function. But shore up is actually not really that way, because shore up ends up getting used to protect your really important creatures in the spell heavy versions. I think the more spell heavy you are, the worse Tolarian Geyser is in a really meaningful way. Same with Stall for Time. Geyser and Stall for Time are very much fundamentally tempo cards, and creatures are the way that you're going to leverage tempo the best. I hope that answers the question. Do you think Mana Worker has a place as an early blocker if you're low on playable cheap creatures or early removal, more than fixing, this being maybe an upside? Consider the Tide Turner. Tide Turner is not a card I've been very happy with. That's the 3 mana 1/3 that can tap for a mana for I don't know, like instant sorceries and kick spells or something. That mana is not very hard to spend in blue decks. Blue decks are using instants and sorceries a lot, but I have not felt very good about Tide Turner. It's also not hard to get Tide Turner in blue-white if you want it. The card goes very, very late. So the idea that you would play Mana Worker just to have a 1/3 blocker when you're not really caring about its fixing is like, why didn't you just play Tide Turner? Tide Turner is like the better way to do that, but also very rarely what you're looking for. Is it actually okay to play Love Song of Night and Day on Chapter 1 on the play if you're forcing an opponent to discard a card? That spot is pretty appealing. Getting up a card is a good thing to do. It's tricky even then because you're getting your creature and your counter later. And so you need to make sure that you're not sacrificing too much from your tempo game where you're like diluting your tempo game into like, when you try to get up a card, you're saying that you're playing an attrition game or a game where attrition matters at least a little bit. Like you're choosing to do less damage to net an extra card. For that to be the choice that you're making, you're clearly not fully dedicated to being aggressive. That said, I don't think blue-white is fully dedicated to being aggressive. And I do think that, this is a deck that, like, you care about getting some damage in, but, like, you're going to be, trading cards, racing. Like, you're not, like, trample aggro combo. You're not, like, any sort of, like, count to 20 burn deck. You're certainly playing an interactive game of Magic. I mean, the answer is it's complicated, but if you're like in, toward the like mid-range space, which is not really a way that people generally describe blue-white, even though it often is. I feel like mid-range is so closely associated for a lot of people with Jund that like talking about kind of the like flexible like aggro control kind of decks, like they kind of don't, people shy away from calling them mid-range way that's just kind of like quirky. Like it's I don't know, I think an artifact of other things. But anyway, the answer is yes. Sometimes I think you can start Love Song of Night and Day on Chapter 1, but not all the time that you're on the play and your opponent hasn't played a 2. Is it correct to do that? You need to pay attention to like, do I think that like the 2 damage or whatever that I'm giving up is 2 damage that I really care about or not? How do you decide if your deck wants Geyser versus Stall for time? I always take Geyser over Stall. Is there a case where Stall is better? I think that if both cards are similarly easy to cast, Geyser is quite a bit stronger. The place where I would take Stall and not Geyser is if I have like 2 blue sources and 7 white sources or something. But I think the cards are just fundamentally not on really comparable power levels. How important and reliable do I put Raph's Pumping to keep you alive or as a win con? I think Raph is a great card. Raph, all of the text on every card matters at least a little bit. I think Raph's Pumping is definitely the less important part of what Raph is up to in general, but the ability is certainly very relevant, has come up a lot. The vigilance matters quite a bit compared to like the 3/2 common that can spend 5 mana to pump your team. Being able to pump your team and give it vigilance is like huge for spots where you're like in kind of a board stall or low on life and you want to be able to start pressuring your opponent without giving up blockers, and really, really good for like ending the game quickly with like birds in a chaplain deck or taking advantage of like the 1/1s that Tura has made or whatever. I think that like Raph having that ability makes Raph much more realistic as a card that like my whole game plan can revolve around this. It's going to like fuel me for a while and then end the game versus just like, oh, this is a cool card advantage engine. To the extent that I was like comparing Raph to a Planeswalker earlier, I think that Wrath is like a planeswalker that has, some kind of loyalty ability that draws a card, and then like activating it once or twice is kind of like Wrath's ultimate in the world where Wrath is a planeswalker. It's not a very strong ultimate, of course, but Wrath's a 2-mana planeswalker that draws cards. So with the cost reducing cycle being such a huge part of the color identity, I feel like those are the actual signpost uncommons, despite being common. What do you think about that take, and how open do you actually feel this format is to varying archetypes? So, I've talked before about that way of looking at it, that I do think that that cycle of commons are really important to understanding the colors identities, and to like having a strong deck is just like choosing part of that cycle to optimize for and maximize. I think blue-white is like among the worst phalanx decks and among the worst terror decks, and that blue-white fundamentally is not about one of those signpost commons. Blue-white is actually about blue and white signpost uncommons, including, of course, protect the negotiators. Like the main blue-white signposts that I think blue-white is about are Wrath, Protect the Negotiators, and Geyser. I think that like thinking about those cost-reducing commons as signposts for the format is correct, but not all decks revolve around any particular kind of signpost. And I think blue-white is a deck in this format that is relatively not prioritizing that particular set of possible signposts, having its own other cards that it's kind of focusing on and revolving around instead. And that, I think, is going to wrap us up. So thank you very much for tuning in, especially those of you in chat for the questions. I will be back next week. Again, a topic determined by Patreon poll. So have a good week. Thanks. And later.